Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the conclusion of Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. We spoke of the question Jesus asked concerning the Messiah as David's son and Lord. Examined the estimation of Jesus of the scribes and Pharisees, which naturally led into the story of the poor widow's offering at the temple. Our session concluded with the great apocalyptic discourse, where Jesus instructs the disciples on what to expect when he has died, risen, and ascended. We discovered that discourse not only spoke to the disciples, but also speaks to us. In the current session, we turn to the final days of Jesus, looking at the Passion narrative. Traditionally, the Passion narrative has been divided into four parts: the Gethsemane Scene, the trial before the Sanhedrin, or the Jewish trial, the trial before Pilate, or the Roman trial, and the actual crucifixion following the Via Dolorosa. We shall examine the first three of these in this session, and the final one in the next session. One may ask, where is the Last Supper? Much of the material on the Last Supper Luke has drawn from the Gospel of Mark. And so, in the interest of time and repetition, I would refer you to the 13th session of the Gospel of Mark in this same series, in particular the end of that session. So then, let us turn to the Passion narrative as it is recorded by Luke. Raymond Brown, in his commentary on the Passion narratives, The Death of the Messiah, notes that connected with each of the sections of the Passion narrative we mentioned above, there is a subsection. The arrest scene is connected to the Gethsemane scene. The denial of Peter is connected to the Jewish trial. The Barabbas scene is connected to the Roman trial, and the burial scene is connected to the crucifixion. In the liturgy of Passion Sunday, the entire narrative of the Last Supper and the Passion is read, which not only takes up a significant amount of time, but also precludes much being said about that as an extended narrative. It's unfortunate that one of the most significant narratives for our salvation must be handled in such a quick and cursory manner. So here, we'll try to present a bit more in-depth explanation. One last thing before we get to the actual Passion narrative. It's important that we know the geography of the narrative. Here is a map of the city of Jerusalem as it was in Jesus' day. You can see on the extreme right in gray the Mount of Olives. This is the locale of the Gethsemane scene and the arrest. In fact, toward the top you can see Gethsemane labeled. It's generally thought that the Jewish trial and correspondingly Peter's denial took place at the house of Caiaphas, which is located toward the bottom center of the map in the lower part of the lower city. The Roman trial and the Barabbas scene, we're told, took place at the Praetorium, which was the place in Jerusalem where the Romans, especially Pilate, conducted business. Scholars are divided on the exact location of the Praetorium. A minority of scholars place it in the old Hasmonean palace, marked by this arrow, which is toward the center of the map opposite the Temple Mount. The majority would place it inside the Fortress Antonia, at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. From there, Pilate could keep watch on the doings on the Mount. The Via Dolorosa that pilgrims walk in Jerusalem begins from the convent of the Sisters of Zion, which is said to be on the spot of the Fortress Antonia, and wends its way through the city to the hill of Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion and the burial. These are enshrined today in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Note, in Jesus' day, these were outside the city walls, as required by law. As you can see, on his last day, Jesus traversed most of the city of Jerusalem. In his Gethsemane scene, Luke abbreviates the Markan narrative. Luke begins fusing the Markan narrative with material from his own sources. The center of action is Jesus, as he comes out from the place of the Last Supper and goes to the Mount of Olives. Adding a particularly Lucan touch, the narrator informs the readers or the hearers that this was a customary act of Jesus. Earlier in the Gospel, at 21:37, we were told that in Jerusalem Jesus taught in the city by day, but at night departed the city for the Mount of Olives. Then attention moves to those accompanying him, the disciples. Clearly, these would be the 11 disciples who were with Jesus at the conclusion of the Last Supper. In that narrative, we were told that Judas departed to assemble the arrest party who will appear in a few moments. Upon arriving at the Mount of Olives, Jesus encourages the disciples to pray. The prayer that Jesus suggests is remarkably similar to the conclusion of the Lord's Prayer as Jesus had taught it to his disciples, especially the words, "not enter into temptation." The prayer that Jesus suggests is that the disciples be spared troubles that take them beyond their capacity to cope. Jesus knows what's coming. The disciples, as yet, do not. Then Jesus separates himself from the disciples a short distance, kneels down, and offers a prayer himself. Kneeling, although it is a common posture of prayer for us, is not a normal posture of prayer for a first-century Jew. They prayed standing. Prayer offered in the kneeling position was a particularly intense prayer. The text of Jesus' prayer follows. As Jesus had taught his disciples, he begins with the address Father, which is a bit more formal than the address used in Mark, the more familiar and intimate Abba, usually translated Daddy. Perhaps Luke wishes to show the gravity of the situation that has demanded this prayer through this address. The prayer of Jesus is that Jesus be spared what's coming. Remove this cup from me. The image of the cup in the Old Testament is usually connected with some sort of suffering. Clearly, that's the suffering and death of Jesus that's at hand now. Yet, in two separate statements, Jesus is clear that he wants to follow the will of the Father, not his own. First, he says, "If you are willing." And then again, reminisced in the Lord's Prayer, he says, "Not my will, but yours be done." This is a tremendous model for us. Many times our prayer is that our will be done. But the true essence of all prayer, as Jesus shows, is not that our will be done, but rather God's will be done. Here is a mosaic that is above the main altar in the Church of All Nations in Jerusalem, which is built on the site of this scene on the Mount of Olives. It graphically depicts the Lucan Gethsemane scene, with Jesus praying on the rock, sweating blood while the angel comes to comfort him. Only Luke mentions the appearance of the angel from heaven. The language used is "Ophthe de auto angelos." There appeared to him an angel. It's word for word the same as the angelic appearances in the infancy narrative, especially the appearance of Gabriel to Zechariah in 1:11. The angel comes to strengthen Jesus in his prayer regarding the battle going on inside of him, and in aligning his will to the will of the Father. The intensity of Jesus' emotion and psychological trauma is further illustrated by Luke's next remark. This prayer is intense. It's described as agonia, That's a struggle, such as an athlete experiences just before the contest. Truly, Jesus is about to enter the great contest with the forces and powers of evil. Even as the God-man, it gives him pause. That intensity is further manifest in a physical reaction. As with any of us in moments of great tension, we sweat. So also Jesus. His sweat was so profuse that it was described as drops or clots of blood falling to the ground. Scholars are careful to note that Jesus did not sweat blood. It was merely that his sweat was as profuse as blood flowing from a cut. Bach puts it well. The remark depicts Jesus' emotional state as so intense that he perspired profusely as a result. The sweat beads multiplied on his body like flowing clumps of blood and dropped to the earth. This truly is the human Jesus. The prayer finishes, and Jesus rises and returns to the disciples. In distinction to Jesus, the disciples have not prayed in his absence. They have slept, which Luke comments was from grief. The thought of what was going to come emotionally exhausted them. So Jesus questions why, and then reiterates what he told them in the beginning. Pray that you not enter into temptation. Here, Luke has significantly telescoped the Mark and Matthean text, and Jesus prays and returns to once find the disciples sleeping. He cautions them. In the midst of Jesus' caution, the arrest party appears. It is described as a crowd, with Judas, the missing 12th disciple, at the lead. Again, Luke is much more succinct than Mark. No reference to weapons, no reference to a prearranged sign, no address of Jesus as rabbi. Judas and the crowd simply appear, and Judas does his deed. He approaches Jesus to kiss him. In the Middle Eastern culture, the kiss was a sign of greeting between friends and a sign of respect. It was, according to many, the common sign of a greeting between a rabbi and a disciple. Here, Judas is totally perverting the significance, turning that sign of respect into a sign of treachery and betrayal. But before Judas can complete the action, Jesus questions him. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? The moment of betrayal is depicted in the mosaic shown here from the Church of all nations. The response of the other disciples is then narrated by Luke. They realize what's about to happen, and they bring out the swords that Jesus has told them to put away a few verses earlier. Lord, they begin, showing their respect for Jesus as rabbi. Shall we strike with the sword? In other words, shall we defend you against this renegade and his followers? They've completely forgotten what Jesus told them about swords earlier. There's no waiting for an answer from Jesus. Instead, one of them strikes the servant of the high priest, who is seemingly part of the arrest party, and cuts off his right ear. Note the greater specificity from Mark, who only mentions an ear. Why this particular member of the party? He was more than likely, the personal representative of the high priest, and thus the leader of the arrest party guided by Judas. Thus, those with Jesus would single him out. It's clear that those with Jesus are not aware of or have forgotten his thought on what was to come. Jesus is quick to remind them. No more of this, he says. Those around Jesus are to cease. And in typical style, the Lucan Jesus touches the servant's ear and heals him. This poignant note is found only in Luke's account. Then Jesus addresses those who have come to arrest him. They are now specified as chief priests and officers of the temple and the elders. Have you come out against me as against a robber with swords and clubs? The word used for robber here is leistes, and it denotes more of a revolutionary who opposes the authority of Rome, or a criminal who does not hesitate to use violence as opposed to the common thief. But from the gospel, it in no way describes Jesus. There have been several occasions in the previous days in which the people could have apprehended Jesus when he was with them in the temple area, but they did not. Rather, they waited till now, in the dead of night. Jesus ends with his estimation of the situation. They are the representatives of the forces of evil that are set on eliminating Jesus. Evil operates in the dark. Hence, this is their hour, the hour of darkness. Once the arrest party has completed their mission, Jesus stands before the Sanhedrin to be tried. There's no mention of the disciples scattering, only the reference of Peter following at a distance. This sets up the second major part of the Passion narrative, the Jewish Sanhedrin trial and Peter's denial. The arrest party is quick. They seize him and lead him away to the house of the high priest, Caiaphas. The peculiarities of these actions continue to mount. First, it's most unusual that the arrest party would apprehend Jesus on the night of the Passover. Second, it's most unusual that the Jewish authorities would gather together to hear the case of Jesus on the night of the Passover. Third, the location is totally out of place. Formal proceedings do not take place at the house of the high priest. They're conducted in the chamber of the hewn stone. All this shows how desperate they are to eliminate Jesus. The site today is marked by a great church by the name of St. Peter in Gallicantu, just outside the walls of the city around Mount Zion. The term Gallicantu refers to the crowing of the rooster, which was the sign that we will see Jesus gave to Peter, that he would deny him 3 times. The weather vane atop the tower is a golden rooster. At the high priest's house, a group gathers in the courtyard. Many of the wealthier homes of the period were built around an open courtyard. Those who lived in the house would enter the home, while the servants, etc., would gather in the courtyard. It was a cool spring evening, and so those in the courtyard built a fire and sat around it, passing the time. Peter joins them. Seemingly, they don't recognize Peter as one of those with Jesus. But that's quick to change, as one of the servant girls catches sight of Peter in the light of the fire and announces, "This man was also with him." Peter immediately responds, "Woman, I do not know him," denying any connection to Jesus. Peter, who earlier, at chapter 22, verse 33, had vowed that he would go to prison or even death with Jesus, when the possibility becomes real, disassociates himself from Jesus. As Bach notes, it's not the high priest or some leader of the Jews who confronts Peter here. It's a little servant girl, a paidiske. Outside of the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, there is a sculpture which depicts the moment that Jesus denied his association with Jesus the first time. The Latin at the bottom of the sculpture is non novi illum, I don't know him. After a short while, another of those in the courtyard saw Peter, and recognized him as one of Jesus' followers. You are also one of them, he said. Again, Peter denies with a certain emphasis, Man, I am not. Not only does Peter deny association with Jesus, but even with Jesus' followers. There seems to be a breather for Peter. No one speaks to him for about an hour. But then another male servant becomes insistent. Certainly, this man was with him, he says. Why is he so sure? For he too is a Galilean. And why would a Galilean be present here with the servants at the high priest's house, warming themselves by the fire, unless he had something to do with the person brought in about an hour ago? How does this servant know that Peter's a Galilean? The general answer is from his accent, his speech, or from his dress. Despite all his attempts to blend in, it seems that Peter certainly did stand out. Peter maintains his position. Man, I do not know what you are talking about. And again, he dissociates himself from Jesus and his followers. No sooner had he begun his final denial than the rooster crows. A very simple but powerful detail. Luke then adds another extremely poignant detail. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Jesus is seemingly near a window in the high priest's house, which opens out onto the courtyard. He has witnessed Peter's denial. He's seen with his own eyes and heard with his own ears the one who would go with him to death deny him, and deny any connection or association with him. That must have been a tremendous letdown. Then Peter remembers what Jesus had said. Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. Earlier, during the Last Supper, Peter had expressed his willingness to go to prison with Jesus and even die with him. Jesus' response was that Peter would deny him using the words that Peter remembers here. Peter certainly must have felt that he had let Jesus down in this dreadful situation. How could he ever face Jesus again? Hence, he goes out and weeps bitterly. Peter felt instant remorse over his denials. His sin of denial crushed his spirit. Here we see Peter weeping and contemplating what has just happened. This mosaic is found in the crypt chapel of the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. From the events in the courtyard of the high priest's house, we turn now to the events inside. We move to Jesus, who is being mocked and beaten by the soldiers who are holding him. This is a common occurrence in the rather brutal enforcement of the day. Those who were considered to be false prophets were subject to such treatment by the authorities as a way of proving their falsehood. Soldiers would blindfold the prisoner and then play games intended to mock his prophetic power. They would strike him and question who did it. They would strike him and ask which hand they used. All this was a means of passing time until the legal proceedings began. The soldiers said many other things against him, blaspheming him. This phrase seems to summarize the entire proceeding. Of particular note is the use of the verb blaspheme. That will be one of the charges ultimately brought against Jesus by the Sanhedrin. Blasphemy. that is, taking upon oneself the prerogative of God. Here, it seems as though Luke uses the verb as a commentary on the treatment of the soldiers. The soldiers act wickedly against him, Jesus, and against the God who sent him. After the interlude on the mocking, Luke turns to the actual legal hearing. When it was day, that is, early morning, Jesus is brought before the assembly known as the Sanhedrin, which is composed of chief priests and scribes, that is, members of both the Sadducee and Pharisee parties. Luke seems to imply that Jesus was held at the high priest's house during the night, and then brought there to the chamber of the hewn stone for the Sanhedrin meeting in the morning. The council gets right down to the nitty-gritty. If you are the Christ or the Messiah, then tell us. This was a political question. In the day, there were many who were claiming to be messiahs, the descendant of David sent by God to reestablish the kingdom of David after eliminating the Romans. Many Jews looked forward to that great day. So Jesus, were he that one, would be of significant interest to the Romans, as he would be considered a seditionist to oppose the rule of Rome. This would be a great help to the Jews in getting rid of Jesus, because Rome would readily ally with them. But Jesus will not outright answer the question. Rather, he mimics their conditional question with a conditional answer. If I tell you, you will not believe. This is in essence a refusal to answer their questions. He continues with another condition. If I ask you, you will not answer. Jesus senses that to answer is pointless. They've made up their minds, so he can't add anything. Recall the question he put before the authorities earlier in the gospel regarding the baptism of John, at Luke 20, 1-8. It was met with silence from the authorities. Jesus senses the situation would be similar here. Changing the subject, Jesus makes a solemn declaration concerning not the Messiah, but rather the Son of Man. From now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. This is an allusion to both Psalm 110:1 and the prophecy of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13. In the first century, the Son of Man was seen as a divine figure who sat at the right hand of God as a judge. In addition, the Son of Man was the favored title of Jesus for himself. So Jesus is saying to the Sanhedrin that it is not he who is being judged in this assembly. Rather, it is he who is judging them. The reaction of the Sanhedrin is quick. Hearing Jesus use the title Son of Man, they immediately jump to the question, is he then the Son of God? Or they could be making a declaration. So then, you are the Son of God. But again, in the first century, the title Son of God was related to the title Messiah. And so their question or declaration may simply be a repetition of their original question in a different form. Or it may be considered a declarative answer to their original question. Jesus' response is just as vague as his response to the question of messiahship was. You say that I am. He's not going to confirm the identity that they're attributing to him. He simply says equivalently, that's your opinion. But the Sanhedrin feels that it has what they need in his not denying that he is the Son of God. They see him then as accepting the title and thus they see him as guilty of blasphemy. What further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips. But have they? He's confessed to nothing. But in their haste and desire to rid themselves of him, they jump to conclusions that are not warranted in their legal procedures. Nothing is said of punishment, as we see in Matthew and Mark, but it can be presumed that they contemplated the punishment for blasphemy, which was death. However, in first-century Palestine, a sentence of death handed down by the Sanhedrin could not be executed by the Sanhedrin. It had to be brought before the Roman authorities, and if they concurred, then they executed the sentence. Hence, it becomes necessary to bring the case to the Roman governor, who happened to be at that time Pontius Pilate. Seemingly acting in solidarity, Luke tells us that the whole assembly rose up and led him to Pilate. Then the accusations which the Jews were bringing are set forth. 3 in particular are listed. We found this man, they begin, misleading our nation. He's a religious agitator who's disturbing the peace with his preaching and miracles, which are riling the people up and could be a potential threat to the control of the Romans. Secondly, he forbids the Jews to pay their taxes to Caesar. This is a total lie. Recall the text on taxes we saw earlier. Jesus emphatically stated that the people have an obligation to pay taxes and support the Romans. But that is to be seen in light of their obligation with regards to God. What the Jews are trying to do here is show Pilate that Jesus is a financial risk to Rome, and in particular to Pilate. Finally, they say, he is a king, calling himself the Christ. This was the very question asked in the preceding hearing, which Jesus did not accept or confirm. Through these 3 accusations, the Jews want to portray Jesus as a revolutionary, who was a definite threat to Roman rule in the area and as such needs to be eliminated. Pilate then responds to their accusations by asking Jesus directly, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Note, he's changed the title slightly. The Jews accuse Jesus of being Messiah. Pilate asks concerning his being the King of the Jews. The Jewish accusation had strong religious overtones joined to the political. Pilate's question is purely secular. Jesus, following the pattern established in the last scene, answers but does not answer. He says, "You have said so." Some commentaries wish to translate this statement as a question. Do you say so? In either case, Jesus is true to form, and he does not affirm what Pilate is asking, nor does he deny it. Nolan notes that Pilate may have been rattled by a question coming from the accused about whether he, Pilate, might be of the opinion that Jesus was the King of the Jews. But that's probably not the case, given Pilate's response to the accusing chief priests and the crowds, that he finds no guilt in this man, Jesus. Despite the accusations brought to him, Pilate looks at Jesus and judges that he is not a political threat. The Jewish accusers are unwilling to accept Pilate's assessment of the situation and his corresponding judgment. Luke tells us that they're urgent, they're insistent, using the Greek verb episkuo, meaning that Pilate's decision made them even stronger in their accusation. They reiterate the charge of sedition. He stirs up with his teaching the people in Judea and in Galilee, even to Jerusalem. Jesus is a threat, a serious threat. And if Pilate wants to keep order in his province, he will eliminate that threat. But their plea does not move Pilate. In fact, it gives him a possible way out of this situation. The mention of Galilee moves the jurisdiction from Pilate to Herod. So perhaps Pilate can hand this off to Herod. That's Herod Antipas. In our next session, we'll continue our discussion of the Passion narrative with the interrogation of Jesus by Herod Antipas. Then we'll examine the way of the cross and Jesus' death and burial. See you then.